story that we're going to share today, I think is a great example of somebody that went through the process of learning a fear, and then in a heartbeat unlearned it.
Man found dead in a random attack.
About a spike in domestic violence.
Hello, Dave.
Nicole, how are you?
I'm good. How are you today?
Good. I have a fresh new haircut.
Yes, I know. It looks very, very good. I noticed it's nice and fresh.
Oh, thank you.
Yes,
Urban
yes.
Shave and Fatty down there. He's the one to check out.
Awesome. So today we're talking about something we all deal with, I think, fear.
Yes.
Yeah, it can play a really big role in your life, and it can be pretty paralyzing. So we're going to talk about what warrants a fear.
Yeah.
Is fear something that is learned? Is it taught by society? How do you get a fear? And, what are our experiences with that too? And also how to get over a fear. We're calling this episode the Boogeyman.
Yeah.
Because traditionally, that's kind of a mythical creature that's associated with really scary things.
Yeah.
But you've got kind of a different take on the Boogeyman. It's not necessarily what you might think it is. It's not necessarily a person or a figure. It can come in all shapes and forms.
It can. And, fear really is, I think, at its essence, it's a huge part in a lot of the crime that we see, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a number of different ends. But I think one of the greatest types of boogeymen that we have, if we're not thinking of it as that mythical creature, is that negative self-talk that we all have in our brains.
Right.
That we're not good enough, or that we're not talented enough, or whatever that could be. Those can be, honestly, some of the biggest boogeymen that we'll ever come across. But of course, they do come in different shapes and sizes, and they aren't always what we expect them to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we grow up, I don't know if if I was to say, describe to me what the boogeyman is supposed to look like, you may have a description in your own mind of what that would be. I don't know.
Yeah, I think, I think of a lot of horror movies that have, like the Freddy Kruegers and the Jasons and, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like those are like the top ones that come to mind when I'm like, this person looks and feels off. I don't want to spend any time with them. Let me get out of your way. So I think we are kind of taught to envision that they actually look a certain way.
Totally.
They have this very unappealing vibe to them, but that's not even necessarily the case.
It's not. Like when I always used to think of the boogeyman, for me it was like, he always drove a white panel van with free candy sort of written across the side of it, right?
Yeah.
That was a thing.
Yeah.
And society has taught us what bad people are supposed to look like. But from my experience, I think boogeymen are really wolves in sheep's clothing. They don't drive white panel vans with free candy written on them. They're people that you would brush shoulders with on any day in a grocery store, out on the bus, on a train, and you wouldn't know sort of the deviance that's within that person.
Yeah, they blend in.
They really do. And over my career, I've met so many people that are exactly like that, just unsuspecting, but responsible for horrific crimes. And of course, after they're caught, we can look at them and go, oh yeah, I find that guy creepy.
Yeah.
But only once we sort of learn the details and the story do we see it that way.
Yeah.
And that's what allows them to exist.
Yeah, and there's a lot of even crime documentaries, true crime, that have, the kind of white picket fence imagery.
That's right.
That a lot of us strive for. The perfect life, perfect marriage, and it doesn't necessarily mean that's what's actually going on behind closed doors. And, I even think back to a notorious serial killer, Ted Bundy, who was very charismatic and charming and handsome. And so because of that reason, he was able to really reel in a lot of his victims very easily.
He complimented the judge at his own trial when he represented himself, the judge complimented him and said, you were a bright legal mind.
Right.
You know, so yeah, he had that ability, that natural charisma. And that was sort of one of the things that he used, of course, in the crimes that he committed. And, you know, I think that when we think of it in that way, we should be sort of mindful that we don't really know what bad people look like, right? So it's going to be following your gut and your intuition to know whether or not you are, you know, the feelings that you have, if you have them, I think they're important to listen to them.
Yeah, because we're not trying to scare our audience and say, hey, it could be your neighbor.
Yeah,
but at the same time, but it could be based on your experience.
Yeah.
But for me, giving the, you know, the less fearful side of things, the less jaded, so to speak, side of things, it's also, but I think you bring up a good point to follow your gut and your instinct.
Yeah.
That should be really your driver. And, you know, it's easy to really push that aside and think you're not being logical, but really that's like the one thing that I feel could be your compass and your guide when, you know, you just don't always jive with people, so follow that instinct.
Oh, I definitely think so.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
stay out of dark places.
Oh, totally. Stay out of dark places.
As we've talked about in the past. Too.
Yeah,
I think
that's
that's
right.
important.
I think it is important. Yeah, for me, the Boogeymans now, you can find them online.
Yeah.
They're behind computers.
Yes.
They're in all these places that we don't traditionally associate them to.
Yeah, yeah, which is so scary because it also, we've talked also about, you know, speaking to your kids about certain things like this and social media and how to prevent, you know, as best as you can, any of these trends, but also these conversations that, you know, that could come up, which can be obviously terrifying. So
when it comes to like that negative self-talk too, like just, you know, it's interesting. As human beings, we are actually wired to sort of catastrophize everything. You know, there's a gal, her name is Maggie Worrell, and she says that humans are designed, hardwired to overestimate risk and underestimate opportunity. And that is sort of a big part of that whole idea of that negative self-talk. Why would I do that? I'm going to fail at it. You know, there's a risk to me by standing up in front of this group of people and sharing my view or sharing my, you know, my perspective.
Yeah.
What are people going to think?
Right.
And instead of like looking at it as an opportunity to maybe inspire somebody or bring a new perspective into a conversation. That's all about sort of that fear element, which is a big part of what Boogeymen bring to the table.
Right. And when we're born, fear isn't, you know, we only have a couple of fears when we're born. We don't know any better. So like, let's talk about that a little bit.
Totally. Like, I was so interesting in the book that I've just put out with Susan Forrest, Undaunted. One of the things we talk a lot about is fear. It's a book about courage.
Okay.
But I think really to understand courage, you have to understand what fear is.
Yeah, it goes hand in hand.
And when I started to look into the sort of the topic of fear, something that struck me very, well, it was odd, but also interesting to me. You know, as human beings, we're only actually born with 2 innate fears: the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. And you can probably just recall back to a time when you had, you know, when your babies were babies, you know, that startle reflex they have if you brought them down too quickly onto the change table of the diaper, the hands will go up, the legs will go up.
Yeah.
And that's because that's an innate fear that they were born with.
Yeah.
No, loud noises being the second. But what I find fascinating about that is this: the things that we fear today, and we have to make a distinction between phobias and fears, I think, a little bit.
Right.
Because phobias are things that they're not as easily dismissed, obviously.
Yeah.
Right?
They're often more like tactical almost.
Yeah, and they do require, you know, help. You know, for people to move past phobias. It is possible for it to happen, but it's more difficult, right? I mean, people need to seek professional advice and help to kind of help move them past a phobia. But when it comes to a fear, that's the things that make us uncomfortable or we're a little bit of afraid of. If we're only born with 2, then if we learn, then everything else we fear in our life has been learned.
Yeah.
So if we can learn it, can we not unlearn it?
Yeah, exactly.
And some of the stories I think today, or the story that we're going to share today, I think is a great example of somebody that went through the process of learning a fear, and then in a heartbeat unlearned it.
Okay. Well, I just think it's so fascinating too that a lot of us are, we don't necessarily like being afraid, but for some reason, the horror movie industry is huge. And around, do you think about Halloween, and people like getting scared? Like there's the thrill of getting scared.
Yeah.
As much as we don't like it, there's something about fear that, excites us. Like, what do you think that is? Why are we drawn to wanting to be afraid?
Yeah, I think it's just sort of that feeling. I mean, people go on
Makes
these.
you feel alive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Possibly, right? And it evokes, fear actually evokes fear responses. Mm-hmm. And until you're in a frightful situation, you don't know what your response is necessarily going to be.
Right.
But I think most experts would agree that there are 5 natural fear responses.
Okay.
One is fight.
Yes.
One is flee. One is freeze. One is fawn. And one is faint. And I think people like the adrenaline rush, the way your heart starts to beat faster, all of those things when you're going into a flee or a fight type of a reaction.
Right. And like the aftermath of that adrenaline when you're safe.
That's right.
How it feels.
But I've seen it, many times, these videos that sort of circulate online now of people that are getting into these like crazy rides.
Yeah.
Being videotaped and then being shot up into the air,
Yeah.
and then fainting.
Right.
Like they're not getting the experience that they actually signed up for, right?
Yeah, they totally
But that
missed
is a
it.
natural reaction.
Yeah.
Freeze is one of those ones too, where it's just that we're paralyzed. The computer in our brain isn't working quite right, and we just
Right.
sort of stop.
Right. Yeah.
And are paralyzed by that fear. But I do think people are seeking out that sort of the response that we see naturally in flight or in fight.
And we typically only hear of fight or flight. So
We
it's
do.
interesting to hear you talk about the other.
Well, fawn is one
responses.
that's actually an unbelievable one. And this is, I think, something we can all relate to at different points in time. If there's somebody that makes us uncomfortable, maybe it's like a hard-nosed boss, or maybe it's a spouse or a partner that, that is somebody that's, for good reason, has made you fearful of them.
Yeah.
We see fawn a lot in the police world when it comes to the intimate partner violence, sadly.
Okay.
What fawning is it's buying in to a person, going over top and above board to please them, essentially.
I see. So that they don't have to ever get to that point
where they
they're
don't escalate
fearful.
to a point where they're going to cause you harm.
So you're not stepping on any eggshells,
It's all, yes, exactly.
keeping things safe.
That's right. And that is fawning.
Right.
And it is something that you see in a lot of abuse situations where a partner will fawn, dote, that kind of thing over their spouse. And that's just that's their way of keeping that type of boogeyman at bay.
Wow.
Yeah, very sad.
And what was the last one you mentioned?
Faint.
Faint.
Yeah.
So that's like
And
the
that's just
physical
that,
response.
It's beyond freeze.
Yeah.
It's an actual okay, the
You're gone.
computer's not, it just shut right off.
Right.
And where I see that happening naturally is in those ride scenarios. Where
Right.
people are going
Your
up and-
body just
Yes.
physically can't handle it. Yeah. As you were talking about that too, I thought about there's an experience in the States, I believe, and it's someone's home, but they have planned, basically transformed their home into this like horror experience, but it can last like hours, and you can pay to like sign up for it. But a lot of people can't even finish it. Like unimaginable things happen in this house. And I'm like, why would you want to pay to actually put your body through this extreme fear, like whatever it is that goes on in there? It's like a whole other level psychologically. I don't know the kind of people who seek that.
But it's creating a physical reaction that I think some people like, right? And that feeling of it.
Yeah, and perhaps they feel numb in other areas in their lives, and it just kind of brings something else.
It's like drinking 10 cups of coffee.
Yeah, right.
And just like really grooving on that experience.
I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess so. We all have our little things that we
yeah.
enjoy. So let's go back to that story then that you were talking about, and how the response has to sometimes be a really, really quick decision. And I think your gut would play into that a lot too.
Yeah, no, totally. Like, I mean, when we think about fear and how it's sort of used in what's a crime story,
Yeah.
it's always about power and control, right? It's often used and associated that way. Gangsters do it, right? If you go against the gang, you're going to be the next one.
Right.
Abusers do it. If you leave me, I'm going to never pay you $1. I'm going to, ruin your career. I'm going to ruin your reputation, whatever it is.
Threats.
All that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And, sex traffickers can do it as well. When I was writing our second book, I came across a young woman I met, and she had an incredible story that would seem like it's not even plausible, but it was for her. She was 27 when her nightmare started. So she was quite a bit older than what you would maybe think a person would be that finds herself in a situation where she's now being human trafficked. But her story, it's all about control, power, abuse, things that she was learning, through her abuse. How it sort of starts is it starts like any other, story like hers, in a bar, hanging out with friends, meets a guy, silver-tongued devil, doesn't see the boogeyman in him. At that point in time in her life, she was dealing with some addiction issue around alcohol.
Okay.
And he was able to use that as sort of his manipulation point, right?
Yeah, so she still had some vulnerabilities that he was
100%.
able
And
to
he
take
could-
for granted.
And he recognized it because he's a lion on the Serengeti plain,
Yeah.
looking for that wounded zebra, and sees
Right.
it in her.
Right.
And so as soon as he does that, he starts to target her, and he works his way into her life in such a way that he's manipulating the suffering that she has through her addiction. And he's being kind to her. He's buying her things, and all along feeding her booze. Until one day the tab is growing to a point where she can't afford it anymore. And one night at his house, after some drinking, she passes out and wakes up a few hours later, or a few minutes later, she's not so sure. And a strange man is on top of her. And that was the very, very beginning of her descent into basically being sex trafficked. Terribly sad.
Yeah.
And through that whole entire experience for her, what was he doing? He was manipulating her through fear.
Right.
I will embarrass you. I will do this. I will do that. You can't leave. I will find you. These kinds of stories. And through it all, and over the next few years of her life, she looked to try and find a way to get out of the situation, but fear kept her there. And then one day, she is in the passenger in his vehicle, and they're driving down the road, and she sees a police car behind her. And she thinks to herself, I am right at the very end of my life. I know I am. She was trusting her gut. She knew things had escalated to a point where she was no longer even physically safe from this individual.
Right.
And she thought, you know what? It's do or die. And in a second, she makes a decision as their vehicle rolls to a stop at a red light and sees the police car behind her. She unlocks that door, and she's out the passenger door and runs right up to the police car and into the back seat. I would imagine the officers were probably extremely surprised.
Right. Right.
But here now is this terrified young woman who has a story to tell, and she made the decision that day to tell it. And ultimately, it saved her life.
And how did that unfold? So she was able to then be escorted by the police.
Yeah, and they were able to get
story.
her, tell her story,
Yeah.
get her access to supports that she was going to need to kind of move through this whole thing.
Wow.
And, use her prepare her for prosecution that would eventually follow against him.
Wow.
And it happened. It all occurred. And today, what is most remarkable is because she had that ability to break that fear, that abuser's fear, She's living her best life.
That's so great to hear.
Another city far away,
Nice.
and has a very, very supportive partner. Has a successful business, and she is somebody that I look up to now and think, you know, how great was it that she was able to do that for herself?
Yeah, and so we know like she was kind of feeling like this was, you know, do or die, quite literally. But did she have a good support system around her at least, or was it, you know?
I mean, so key, you know, when it comes to it, she did.
Good, yeah.
She came from a good family.
Because I'd imagine that a lot of that courage comes from knowing that's there too.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's such an important point, Nicole. I think, you know, she came from a supportive family. They were trapped. They actually had a lot of fear too. You know, I'm sure if you were to speak to them, they'd say, we feared for our daughter's safety every day.
Of course.
And they knew that she was kind of in this descent. However, they also knew that there wasn't anything they could really easily do for her at that moment in time, except for to support her.
Right.
And that will be a theme that we kind of weave through all of this. We have to be able to create, through all of our episodes, we have to be able to create these safe landing spaces for people. If we do, we don't know when they're going to come.
Right.
But they know that they can come.
Yes. And also highlighting that even if you don't have the support system in the form of like a friend or family, that there are resources out there and hotlines.
Yes.
And, you know, phone numbers and even Facebook groups and communities that you can join to really create that sense of safety and that support system too.
I absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the tricks, tricks of in this case, a pimp essentially.
Yeah.
You know, was to eliminate or remove that person so they felt like they had nobody else to turn to.
Isolation.
Right. But it is only a trick. For people like this young lady that were in this situation, they were able to draw on their previous life and the support they had with that family to be brave enough to sort of unlock that door, hop out, and step into a new life in a matter of seconds.
Yeah, wow.
But it comes down to support.
Courage, and, you know, also taking advantage of the opportunities and stepping into those lucky breaks when they're presented in front of you.
And she did.
Yeah. And so as a victim, I'm sure there was a lot that she feared.
Yeah.
But so you kind of have an interesting take on like fears on all sorts of levels, from victims to, you know, investigators, to the bad guys, to witnesses. Yeah. So let's run through like some of those fears. So the victim herself, you know, I'm sure there's a fear of like, will they believe me?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
That's a huge one.
Yeah.
You know, I read a statistic not long ago that it's suspected about 84% of victims of sexual assault, their crimes go unreported. And why is that? A lot of it drives fear driven, right?
Yeah.
Will they be believed?
Yeah.
Right? Will they be judged?
Or repercussions on my family. Yeah. Yeah.
On the family, or the self-blaming, that negative self-talk that they have. Like, well, it was sort of my fault. I kind of put myself into this situation.
Right. Right.
These are false narratives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but it is one that is definitely a driver on why we have such a horrendous statistic that way.
Of course. Yeah.
So the fear of not being believed is a big one. The fear of being judged.
Yeah.
The fear of having to go to court.
Right. Kind of stepping into a world you're not familiar with.
The fear of being re-victimized. The fear of being re-victimized.
Right, or it happening again. Is
That's
that
right.
what you mean by that?
Yeah, he's coming back.
Yeah.
Or she's coming back, or whoever it is, right?
Right.
But that fear is very natural as well.
Yeah, it becomes this trauma that you're having to deal with now for possibly the rest of your life, potentially.
We used to see it with like families that went through like something, again, you know, we touched on in our very first episode, you know, break and enters, a property crime, but it's not. It is really a crime against people. There's a victim behind it.
Violation, yeah.
And I remember, you know, years ago when I was investigating these things, how fearful families were, especially children in those families.
Yeah.
That the bad person that had been in their home would be coming back again.
Right, right.
You know, and so that is a very natural fear as well.
What about witnesses?
So witnesses, I mean, I think they fear a lot of the same things. I think the biggest witness fear, though, comes from stuff they've seen on TV and movies.
Right.
And what do you, like, if I was to ask you, what do you think witnesses fear the most about being a witness?
Well, I would just think that it's like you didn't see what you saw, or the threat of what we can do if you speak up about it. So it's more to do with, like, again, my family, and that might be like kind of an extreme like mob thought.
No, you're right.
But
that's what everybody fears.
that's what I would care for the most. Yeah.
And Nicole, you're not wrong. You know, the number one reason why people don't come forward with information is because of that fear. But is it actually realistic?
Right.
We learned it. Where did we learn it? Well, we learned it from these, you know, movies and TV, and when these one-off stories where a witness was targeted.
We'll find you. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I got to tell you, and I'll knock on wood here.
Okay.
But I, in my time investigating murders over almost 15 years, do you know how many witnesses were ever targeted and murdered because they were a witness? None.
Okay. That's good to know.
Zero. In fact, what I found and what we found was people that held on to information for other people,
Yeah.
if you were later determined to be the weak link, that might be the motive behind why you have now been murdered. And we did see that play out several times where somebody was holding on to a secret for somebody.
Interesting.
And then the group goes, oh, this
We don't
person
like
might
that
be a
it's out
weak link.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it was Benjamin Franklin, he once said that 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead.
Oh, yeah.
And that can be sometimes the motto. So if you are a person that hasn't come forward to the police and you're holding on to a secret, I would actually say, at least statistically in our city, you're at greater risk of becoming a victim of violent crime.
Yourself. Wow. What about criminals? We kind of touched on them in an earlier episode about kind of, you know, providing them that reset in the interrogation room because so many of them fear jail time.
Jail.
Yeah.
That's the number one. But I mean, the other big one is reputation.
Reputation.
How does this going to make me look?
Yeah.
You know? And so when you address that kind of a fear, like say in an interview with a reputation, and you give an opportunity for a person to tell their version of events or their story, they're going to make sure if their reputation was the thing that was what they were afraid of losing,
Yeah.
they're going to make sure that they do their part to minimize their role in it and provide some context or a different point of view on why something may have happened.
Right. And what about investigators? What do you guys fear?
Yeah, so like, well, I think it would, you know, there's probably a wide range, but I think we also fear our reputation.
Yeah.
You know, I think that we collectively as a group are people that want to be seen as effective, people that are professional and that they're doing right by families and victims. And I hate the idea of something that I was always afraid of was, you know, not being able to bring an answer back to a family member.
Right.
It kept me up at night.
Right.
Like, and it got me up at 3 a.m. It poked me, you know, like this imaginary finger, but it was always there.
Yeah.
And you wanted to try and bring resolve to families as best you could. So it was something I feared.
Yeah.
I know other officers, like say officers are part of like a tactical unit or a SWAT team, you know, they're synonymous in terms for me.
Yes.
But those guys, they work in these team environments and they're going into these high-risk situations,
Of course.
crazy situations.
Yes, yes.
And I bet you if you ask them what they feared, they're going to say things like,
Their safety.
well, no, letting down their teammate.
Oh, wow.
A big one,
Yes.
you know, it's like letting down my team, doing something that puts somebody else at risk.
Right.
You know, one thing that's kind of weird about police, but it has something that's to be dealt with very early on, is you have to be able to understand that your own mortality. You have to be willing.
I guess when you're called to that, it's something that you can
Right.
kind
You
of
have
come
to-
to terms with
You have to.
in a way, like firefighting. And
That's right.
Yeah. so
Any
many
of those,
roles.
any of those careers are going to put you in a place. You at some point in time, you're going to come to terms with your own mortality. But it would be very, very difficult to live with a situation or a decision that you made that actually impacted other people.
Yeah, because that could eat away at you for
Right.
the rest of your life.
That's
which
right.
for some, I'm sure, is even worse.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
So what would you say your main kind of takeaway and key message for our viewers and listeners would be today?
Like I think, and I don't know what you think as we kind of delve into this a little bit, But I think we should take a page out of the young woman in our story today. And that, you know, if there's a fear that is restraining you right now, or a fear that is holding you back, right? Recognize where that fear is coming from first. Yeah. How did you learn it in the first place?
Right.
And is it realistic?
Yeah.
And if you've learned it, know that you can unlearn it.
Right.
And that you can be brave.
Yeah.
And bravery is in all of us.
Yeah.
What we have to do is unlock the door.
Unlock the door. Yeah.
And step out.
I think it has a lot to do with learning more about the fear as well. And I see a therapist, which I always, you know, recommend because it feels so good to just talk about things and unload things.
Right.
But she talks about you name it to tame it. Name it to tame it. So when you've learned about it and you kind of know the ins and outs of how it works.
Totally.
And it can be anything from, like, you know, an issue with a friendship, relationship, something at work, and even a fear. If you learn more about it, it doesn't feel as scary, and you can recognize it and you can feel empowered by it because you're like, oh, I know what's going on here.
I love it.
Yeah.
That is the way to tame the boogeyman.
Yeah, tame the boogeyman.
Tame the boogeyman.
So on that note, thank you so much for today's chat. It was super interesting. We are going to get a little more technical into some future episodes.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn about, like, how you gain evidence and how you use evidence to actually solve a crime and piece it all together. So make sure that you stay tuned, like and subscribe, and keep following along on The Ride Along. Well, we hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Ride Along. And if you're interested in learning more about Dave's career and the lessons he learned throughout, now that he's on the other side of it, be sure to pick up a copy of his book that he co-wrote with Sarah Cades called Skeletons in My Closet. And keep an eye out for his new release, Undaunted, with Susan Forrest.
My mantra of leaving people better than you found them continues to be my driver. And I hope you're leaving this podcast today feeling inspired, informed, and inclined to live your dash. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please be sure to like and subscribe. And take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us on The Ride Along.